introduction. Hi, everybody. It's so great to be back here. It's nice to see a full room. I'm very excited for this session and this conversation with Adam to talk about the real work on the mystery of mastery. I will point out that my dog, of all of the books lying around the house, chose this one to chew up, so I consider that a real honor. But I want to just say that despite the dog bites, this book is not what it appears, or at least it wasn't it wasn't the book that I thought it was going to be before I started reading it. And you kind of give that away in the top by saying, this is a self-help book that won't help, which I love. So this is a book on mastering skills, but it is not, very much not a how-to. There's no such, I kept waiting for the, chatter about the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice that Malcolm Gladwell talks about. It is not that at all. It is about, and I'm going to ask you about this later, about the concept of achievement over accomplishment, and how mastery really intersects with us as humans in all glorious and flawed selves. And one of the most wonderful things about this book, Adam, and we're going to talk more about this, is that as someone who clearly, as you know from the introduction, and I think everybody knows, who in this room knows who you are, who you've mastered many things, but you make yourself incredibly vulnerable in this book, which I think is part of its power. So I want to start, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
May I say that it is it's such a thrill to be back in Aspen. This book actually, in a sense, started in Aspen. I gave a lecture at the Ideas Festival, which I think you can still find online. My sleeves are much too long, as my wife pointed out. But I actually gave a talk on the mystery of mastery here, which was one of the things that impelled me towards the book. And on this very stage, I gave the best lecture of my life a few years ago, because I was here for Winter Words, and I couldn't decide which of two lectures I had in mind to do. And my two kids were with me. I'm sort of the Willy Loman of American literature. I'm in perpetual motion, trying to sell my books and be well liked, and I have two kids, as Willie did. But mine two said, Dad, do both lectures. I said, what do you mean? He said, just get up there and do both lectures. They were goading me on, and I got up here and I did two lectures, one after another. Okay. So it was my most nearly virtuosic thing. Anyway, it is a joy to be here. And yes, absolutely. The point of this book was not to, in fact, that line which you picked out was originally the first line of the book. That was the opening line of the book. This is a self-help book that won't help. And my publishers and editors sort of pled with me, please don't say that, because it's the first thing people will see on Amazon and so on. So I moved it stealthily towards the end of the introduction and said, but yes, that's the premise of the book. And it's not if I may I don't know how to put this well, it's not a modest premise in the sense it's not only doesn't it include recipes, but I don't think any such things exist. And it's an attempt to vindicate, if you like, for the humanities, the idea that the study of how it is we learn things and master things isn't susceptible to rule-making, but is only susceptible to humane investigation.
Well, and you talk about how the inspiration for this book, just keying off what you just said, is, I mean, here you are, one of the foremost critics of art and, reviewer and somebody known for their discernment of all these things, and yet you had a realization that you actually had no relationship to the skill of what it means to create art.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was sitting at a dinner party in Manhattan a few years ago, and it was when our kids were still in a progressive grade school. And the key thing about a progressive grade school in New York is that it starts at 7 in the morning. So when it gets to past 9:30 at night at a dinner, you're kind of gripping the underside of the table and praying that it will be over soon, because you're going to have to be up in what feels like 4 hours. And making conversation in this agonized state, I realized that the person across the table from me introduced himself and said, kind of brusquely, I teach drawing. And so I said, on an impulse, would you teach me to draw? Exactly because, as you say, I recognized that though I had been writing about art and functioning sporadically as an art critic over that time. I did not know how to draw. And when I say I did not know how to draw, I don't mean I didn't know how to draw well. I mean, I could not draw anything. And when I started studying with this wonderful guy, Jacob Collins, who turned out to be, and I think that's what attracted me at the dinner, not just an expert drawing master, which indeed he is, but a wildly reactionary drawing master who believed, I said sort of with, boastfully, I said, well, I'm going off to the Getty to talk about Cézanne, but I'll be back shortly. And I thought that sounded impressive. And he looked at me and said, oh, you like Cézanne? And he said it just the way you might say, oh, you like the poker playing dogs, do you? It's like only people with terrible taste would like Cézanne. And it turned out that Jacob believes that Western art took a fundamentally wrong turn in 1854. And that his whole goal and project in life is to return Western art to the condition it was in a French atelier under the tutelage of Ingres in 1854. And the amazing thing is that in that he's recreated in New York, in his own atelier, exactly the conditions of a Parisian Beaux-Arts, classically minded atelier in 1854. Anyway, and I walk in, and then it's all just a combination of classical statuary, naked people, and candlelight. And
the usual, and he put me to work learning how to draw. And I would hold the pen like this with pencil and stab like Lady Macbeth, trying to make meaningful marks. And he loosened my hand, taught me to begin making marks underhand. And I spent 2 years studying drawing. You could make the case, and I don't think it's a false case, that it isn't essential for a critic to be in any sense a master or even a practitioner of the art. And that's certainly true. You don't have to be able to hit a 100-mile-per-hour fastball to be a good sports writer. And many of the greatest sports writers, like my own hero, A.J. Liebling, were portly and uncoordinated men. But I genuinely think, Liebling, who wrote brilliantly about boxing, knew how to box. And I genuinely think that if you don't know what it's like to swing and miss at a 100-mile-per-hour fastball, in some sense you're missing some of the kind of basic kinesthetic knowledge of what the task is. And the other thing is, just to add, I think that as I get older, I value craft in my own art. I'll call it that without apology, of prose writing more and more, and I am appalled at poorly made sentences and worshipful of those who can make beautiful sentences. And loving craft as much as I do, it seemed hypocritical for me to be in any way dismissive of the craft of art making. You talk about the difference between knowing that and knowing how.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And knowing after studying with Jacob for 2 years, and I hope one of the things, it was interesting, I sat in just these circumstances with my good friend Malcolm Gladwell, author of the 10,000 Hours and other things. And he said, with his usual contrarian insightfulness, he said, you think this book is all about learning to do things, but it's not. It's all about these teachers. It's about you falling in love with teachers.
Right.
And that was an insightful thing. And this is a book that's filled with irascible teachers of various kinds. And one of the funny things about being Willy Loman, being out on the road all the time, is you actually learn things about your work from the people who arrive. And one of the things that I realized is that it is about teachers, and particularly, in Greek mythology, the great teachers are all centaurs, right? They're the wild beasts. They're not the civilized people. They're the crazy, wild ones. And that's true about great teachers. A great teacher needs some note of savage danger, or he's not, or she is not persuasive. So Jacob is certainly that. He's a wonderful guy, and we became very close friends, but he still has utter contempt for my taste in the arts.
Good to know. Mm-hmm. So you talk about these. There's a series. So by the way, I highly encourage everybody to buy the book, read the book. It's absolutely wonderful. But you try throughout the book, you try your hand at different forms of mastery. So we talked about drawing, driving, baking, boxing, dancing, and of course there's another personal mastery we'll get to a little bit later. I don't want to talk about that right now. But what are the key things? So, and it is true, you have this love of all of the teachers and all of these things that comes really shining through What does connect all of those?
Well, first of all, it wasn't a kind of high concept book. In other words, it wasn't that I said to my publisher, let me go out and I'll learn to do all these things. I did the drawing for the motives that I just described. I had to learn how to drive because my wife had been doing all the driving in our family forever, and finally got to the part I was always in what is the gendered woman's seat, right? I was always the one saying, hey kids, shh, guys, be quiet for a bit. Your mom's trying to find the exit, right? Yeah. Okay, who wants a cookie? We'll be there soon, right? And having sat in that seat for 25 years, I thought might be useful to find out what it's like in the seat alongside. So in my mid-50s, I finally learned to drive with a brilliant teacher named Arturo Leon. And then I wanted to learn to bake with my mother because she was aging, and I thought it was a way of our having a conversation. But what connects them all is partly the romance of these wonderful teachers, and it's also, my fascination with craft, with virtuosity of that kind. Mastery not in the sense of absolute, the kind of geniuses who dominate a field, because one of the things that's interesting, I think, is that the more you study the way we learn, the more you become aware that mastery of one kind or another is available to all of us who want to pursue something with some kind of passion and perseverance. And the people who are the most extraordinary, usually it isn't that they have the greatest degree of technical virtuosity, that's what the real work is about, it's that they've brought into dialogue with their virtuosity some note of deliberately willed imperfection that enlivens and humanizes their work. I was out on the road. I ended up in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the Bob Dylan Center. Bob Dylan gave all of his archive to a place in Tulsa. I think partly because he wants to continue to pretend that he comes from the Southwest rather than being a nice Jewish boy from Minnesota. And, he talks, he sings like he's from the Southwest, and I think he's still trying to pass. Anyway, in the Bob Dylan Center, there's this amazing letter that Dylan wrote, because one of the things we learn in life, right, is that Bob Dylan is Bob Dylan, but everyone is incredibly sensitive to criticism, and everybody knows what the knock on them is, right? And there's a letter from Dylan saying, I know that people say I don't sing really well. He said, and I know I don't sing well, but I breathe better than anybody else. And it's true if you think about it. What do we listen to Bob Dylan for? It's his breathing, right? That's the key thing in his singing, and he brought his peculiar pattern of breathing to song. That's what makes Bob Dylan, not that he's Pavarotti of another kind.
So you talk about sort of the difference between achievement and accomplishment. I mean, if anything, that's kind of like the through line of the whole book, really.
Yeah, in fact, earlier today, just this morning, sitting in our beautiful Aspen Hotel, I finished a new book, which will be just a short kind of,
you did. Yeah.
which will be one of those things. I extracted out from this book that theme about why accomplishment matters more than achievement, and how we live in a society devoted to the tyranny of achievement. And I did it as a little piece in your old paper, in the New York Times. And it, how that is, it's shook the meter a little. And so my publisher said, let's do it as a little commencement book for graduation next year. That's become a whole genre of American literature.
Oh, the places you'll go.
Yeah, exactly.
It's sort of the granddaddy.
Exactly, and David Foster Wallace's beautiful book and so on. So I put it together. So the thesis, the theme of that little book, and it's in this book, you should still buy this book first, because the little book will be out next year, is that we live in a society that's devoted to the tyranny of achievement, right? We drive our kids from one grade to another. We drive them from one test to another. We drive them towards a select college, and then once they've achieved at the select college, we drive them towards a select law school or medical school or graduate school. And yet, when we think of our own experience, we almost always, if you're asked what changed your life, it's always a moment of accomplishment that was entirely inner-directed and probably had no obvious fallout in your work, in something that paid off in any way. For me, it was when I was 12 years old, I went into my room with a $40 folk guitar and a big book of Beatles songs, and I laboriously, literally painfully, because as everyone here knows who plays the guitar, and Olivia and I visited the gorgeous guitar store in town here yesterday just so I could show off to the guy in the store. But as everyone knows, the action of a cheap guitar is incredibly high, and I had to literally get my fingers bleeding to learn a G and a D and a chord. But sitting in that room and being able, however ineptly, to master 3 Beatles songs gave me a kind of platform of accomplishment that stayed with me through life. That's the one way I know that I can get things done, is because I got that done. And it's fascinating to me because almost everybody I speak to has a story like that. Sometimes it turns into a vocation. Sometimes that's what we do. But other times it has nothing to do with anything. This wonderful Scottish poet named Don Patterson has a wonderful new memoir out, and in it he talks about growing up in this working class family in Dundee, Scotland, and becoming at exactly the same age in exactly the same way utterly fascinated by origami, becoming obsessed with folding paper. And you can imagine the response in the Scottish working class neighborhood to a 12-year-old kid who just wants to do origami, folds paper all the time. But he says, I became a poet because I became obsessed with origami. Yeah. And I think that that's a broad general truth, and that's what accomplishment is. And I think that when we value I saw it with my own son, Luke, who became energies into mastering the Erdnase color change and this great Di Vernon, who was the greatest card magician, routine called Triumph and so on. And at his very progressive but nonetheless driven school, they were not crazy about the amount of time he was spending doing Triumph as opposed to doing trigonometry and Spanish and so on. But I think I recognized that was his guitar chords. That was his accomplishment. And it was transforming his life in a completely positive way. It was giving him a sense of meaning and purpose. And he had, I profile in this book, of all the irascible, crazy teachers I encountered in the course of writing this, the single most irascible and passionately crazy in a positive sense teacher, a great magician named Jamie Ian Swiss, who is, most magicians have to accept that there'll always be a kind of secondary art form, right? Because aside from a birthday party or two, we don't take magic seriously. But Jamie is the intellectual of magic. And as I say in the book at some point, for most magicians, their life is as if, because they have this unbelievably high level of technical expertise, but it's as though Yo-Yo Ma, right, was putting on a recital, and everybody felt free to come up to Yo-Yo after the recital and say, I know how you did that. Yeah. You dragged that thing across those strings. That's
Anybody
how you do that.
Yeah,
I have an uncle who does that at birthday parties, right? And most magicians sort of nod and say, yep, you're right, that's how I do that, right, exactly. And Jamie is the one who sort of snarls and says, you have no fucking idea how I did that. And your uncle is not a magician, he's a guy, and he's a beautifully difficult man as a consequence, but a great teacher. Yeah. And he said to Luke, finally, you want to be serious about magic, kid? You got to come to Las Vegas. You're never going to learn it here in New York. Magic's in Las Vegas. And so Luke said to me, Dad, my ambition is to be a lounge magician, and I need to go to Las Vegas if I'm going to do that. And in one of the few good moments of parenting, I can claim, I said, okay, let's do it. Let's go out to Las Vegas and find out what that world is like. And that's where this book began.
Wow. Yeah. And in fact, the book, the title of the book, The Real Work, comes from magic. So explain what the real work, what that means.
On that trip to Las Vegas with Jamie and Luke, I was stunned because all the magicians have the most beautiful shop talk of any people I know, right? Shop talk is the most rapturous kind of talk we ever have. But writers, we don't have a lot of shop talk, right? Because we can talk about what assholes our editors are and about
ridiculous deadlines.
Ridiculous deadlines and advances, right? Inadequate advances, ridiculous deadlines, and editors. But magicians have fantastic shop talk because they can only talk to each other, right? The only person you can talk to about magic with is another. So the minute they're together, they fall on each other. And when at 3 in the morning, after everybody's gig is done in Las Vegas, they get together at a bar or in a diner, a wonderful diner, and they start talking. And I would always hear them use the expression, the real work. They'd say to each other, Philosoph's illusion, who's got the real work on that? Or Erdnase color change. Who's got the real work on that? And I was fascinated what they meant by this. And over time, I realized what they meant exactly was not who had originated it. They didn't mean that. They didn't mean who did it with the greatest technical virtuosity. They meant who combined technical virtuosity with an empathetic engagement with the audience, who really knew how to land that stunt, that trick, that illusion with an audience, not who did it best technically, who had empathetic engagement. That's who had the real work. And as soon as I understood that's what they meant, of course, it immediately lit up my own mind because it's a transitive idea. We all know who has the real work in anything. You know, it's one of the two questions. I'm sure you have like questions when you're doing an interview, right? What you know are good questions. And one of the two questions that I have learned is a great question is to say to someone, doesn't matter what field they're in, who's the Willie Mays or the Wayne Gretzky of your profession, right? Could be a plumber, it could be a painter, right? But you say, who's the Wayne Gretzky of your field? They always have an answer, right? You're talking to a plumber, they'll say, oh, Joe Pantalini. You're that guy. Put a wrench in that guy's hand and you will not believe. You know, he could turn off all the water in New York and turn it back on and no one. And there's always someone who's like that, right, in every field. And so that's what the real work is, and that's what fascinated me. It's not just being really good at doing it, but it's knowing, because magic is done with your mind, not with your fingers. And talking about, you know, Bob Dylan or Jimi Hendrix or someone else, when you say those guys have the real work, that's just what they mean. Even in our world of writing, when we talk about the real work in writing, we certainly don't mean who's got the greatest grammatical expertise, and we don't even mean who's got the broadest vocabulary. We mean who's got a voice on the page. Who's got a voice on the page that you can't resist, right? And when we're seeking as young writers to find ourselves, we're looking for our voice. And the moment, I wrote in a previous book, At the Stranger's Gate, about the moment when I felt I found my voice. That's what we connect to. And we don't really care if we love Alice Munro or J.D. Salinger or whomever, what they're writing about in a sense. We just had this wonderful moment of relaxation when we're in their company because we love that voice.
It's sort of like combining the actual mastery with sort of the essence of who you are.
Yes, exactly.
It's unique.
Exactly.
So, you know, you talk about, as you go deeper into the book, you know, you're talking about specific skills, but you then reveal something, a very different kind of challenge, aside from sort of like, you know, drawing or driving, a very specific challenge that you faced personally and that you were determined to master. And it was very personal, and I thought, very brave thing to write about. So can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. It's the way you describe it now, everyone's saying, what the hell could it possibly be? And it's just a personal phobia. I suffer from a phobia called periuresis, which is, to be blunt, extreme shy bladder syndrome. It's people who can't urinate in any public place at all, on a plane, in a restaurant, anything. There is actually an international periuresis association that has has 100,000 members. It's a very widespread and unspoken phobia. And it sounds embarrassing and ridiculous when you mention it, but if you suffer from it, it's very debilitating. It means you can't go. To this day, I've never been able to go to a literary festival in India or Australia because of it, and it's very crippling. I have a good friend, a great composer named Chet Biscardi, who was generous enough to let me use his name, who was on his way to a premiere of one of his works in Berlin and had to get off the plane before it took off because he was in a phobic state about it. And I wanted to write about it for two reasons. One, for literary reasons, if you can imagine. Mike Nichols, the great director, once said in my presence something that's always haunted me, which is that in every work that you do, whether it's a play or a movie or a book, there should be one thing in it that everyone involved said, oh, we can't do that, can we? We can't get away with that, right? And that crosses the line. We shouldn't do that. Oh. Because if you don't have that in it, it's sort of like tannins in red wine. If you don't have something that's a little difficult, everything will seem too easy. And I recognize that this was especially for a writer like myself, who's not known for that kind of audacity, this was an audacious thing to do. And I will tell you, because I am blessed, let me revise my conversation, I am blessed with brilliant and generous and kind editors. Let me put that on the record right now.
If they're listening.
If they're listening. So when I finished it, my wonderful wife, who's very protective of me, said, why don't you send that to David Remnick and see what he thinks about it? Can you get away with it? I sent it to Remnick, and he said, yeah, of course. He said, you got to publish this. He said, you got to publish it. It's truthful and it's brave. And hovering over both David's sensibility and my own is the memory of our shared mentor of a kind and dear friend Philip Roth. And one of the things that Philip always was passionate about was the necessity of audacity in writing. You couldn't be shy about masturbation, famously, which he turned into an American masterpiece. You couldn't be shy about anything that was part of the job of writing is to make private life public. And if you became dainty about making private life public, then you weren't. Then you were failing in your thing. So that's why I wrote that chapter. And I was blessed once again to have a fantastic teacher, a great therapist. Oh, and the other reason for doing it was that I wanted, it's sort of struggling with a phobia. My teacher, my therapist, Dan Rocker, said to me when we were in the midst of all this, he said, everybody's got something. He said, look out. I'm looking out at this audience, or as he said in the subway car in New York, he said, and every single person you're looking at is struggling with something right now. It could be, it could be insomnia, it could be OCD, it could be vertigo, it could be a fear of flying. Every single person is struggling with something, and that's our humanity is in that struggle, and that sense of being connected to people through that struggle is one of the forms of mastery that every one of us, essentially, I'll go so far as to say every one of us, undertakes, is the mastery over the phobias and the fears and the anxieties that have a grip on us. And what's interesting about it is that the way we disassemble an anxiety or a phobia is exactly the way we assemble the mastery, only we have to do it in reverse, because the way we achieve anything is by breaking it down to small, specific, often very stubbornly counterintuitive steps. It's how you learn to draw, it's how you learn to play the guitar, it's how you learn to dance with your daughter. And then over time, it becomes this seamless sequence that you feel you have mastery over. And getting over a phobia or an anxiety disorder is exactly the same thing in reverse. It has taken its steps and implanted them inside you as what feels like the seamless sequence of something you can't break out of. So you have to figure out what were all those steps that happened, how can you disassemble them until you no longer are the captive of that phobia. Yeah. So it's the same exact process, only run in reverse.
And I love that in that process, you also found a wonderful teacher, as you mentioned.
Yes, yeah, so, exactly.
So it is, I think, one of the things that that is sort of a line which maybe won't make sense outside of the context of the book that I love, which comes from your driving teacher, which is become the noodle.
That's the take. That's the more. Thank you. That's exactly what I always thought wanted to be the takeaway of the book. Arturo Leon, my wonderful driving teacher, said to me, because he could see that I was in a state of absolute nervous panic behind the wheel, right? Because I was 54, 55, struggling this. Because the thing about driving, which none of you will know because you all learned to drive when you were 16 or 17. The thing about driving is that unlike dancing or drawing, it's not really very difficult. It's just insanely dangerous. And when you're doing it in your 50s, all you can think about is, I've got 3 tons of metal here under my control. I'm going 50 miles an hour, and nobody can stop me. Yeah. I can do anything here. This is so dangerous. Someone please take this out of my hands, right? Because it is. And Arturo could sense that anxiety. He said to me, Adam, just become the noodle, become the noodle. And I said, Arturo, what do you mean become the noodle? He said, you want to be, the way a noodle, he said, when spaghetti is well made, it's firm, but it's flexible, right? And that's true, right? You become the noodle. You want to be firm in the seat, but you want to be flexible all the time. And that's true about every form of mastery. We become the noodle. When you're writing, you want to become the noodle.
It's sort of like maybe this is a much less interesting phraseology than become the noodle, but it's what people talk about when they talk about flow.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's exactly it. And that's one of the things that is implicit in the book is that we enter that flow state, right, exactly, as we become the noodle. And that's true.
So one of the things you talk about how, some things are hard but not dangerous, some things are easy but driving incredibly dangerous. There's another sort of juxtaposition that you put in the book that I like, and I maybe didn't get this quote exactly right, but that you write that activities that are interesting to read about are probably dull to do, while activities that are dull to read about are interesting when you attempt them.
Yes. Did I say that?
Did you?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. No, it's true, that there's a kind of, there's some things that we struggle to learn to do. Writing, for instance, is a good example of that. Getting to be a good writer is just a matter of sheer perseverance in front of a keyboard for 5 or 6 hours. I've been writing seriously for the past 43 years, since I arrived in New York in 1980, and I've been doing it 6 hours a day, 7 days a week since then. And that's all the expertise you can get in writing comes from that. Other things, like learning to dance, for instance, is something that has a much more lively kind of dialogue in it with your partner, with your teacher. A lot more fun to write about, and probably harder. Though I'm sure when you do it at the Fred Astaire level, it's exactly susceptible to the same kind of discipline.
So speaking of dancing, one of the sort of what feels to me like the coda to the book is, as you're going through these various things that you are attempting to master, towards the end of the book, you talk about learning to dance. And you did that with your daughter, Olivia, who is here.
Right here,
who is
here today with me, keeping me company.
And it was so, as a parent, and so many people in the room are parents, it was so wonderful that the two of you were on this journey together. So just talk a little bit about that.
Well, I have many blessings in my life, but the largest are my kids. Even I get very fun thinking about that. And so Olivia and I think I can fairly say have always been very close. In fact, I wrote an entire book, which is my favorite of all my books. Put this one aside, because this is the best I've ever done. This is the masterpiece. Called Through the Children's Gate, which was about her childhood in New York in the shadow of 9/11. And it has some well-known pieces in it. Olivia had an imaginary friend named Charlie Ravioli, who some of you may remember, who was always too busy to play with her because she was a little girl growing up in New York. So we've always had, I like to think, an intimate friendship along with being father and child. And Olivia was going through a lot of changes in her life, and I was going through some in mine. And I said to Olivia, at the height of the pandemic, darling, why don't we just take ballroom dancing lessons together? Why don't we just learn to dance together? And Olivia, to my great joy, and to some degree my surprise, said instantly, Dad, that would be great. I would love to do it. And we found this teacher named Steve Dane, who I always called Steve Dance because the words were so close. And it was the height of the pandemic, so we couldn't go inside a dance studio, so we had to do all of our teaching and learning on the Esplanade in Central Park. And we would go out, and Steve would bring his boombox along and play Sinatra records, Fly Me to the Moon. And he would teach us the foxtrot and the steps of the foxtrot. And Olivia and I would dance together. And it was a way, I think I can say, Olivia will have other and more her own insights into it. It was a way of having a conversation. We're both highly verbal, argumentative people, and we love to argue back and forth, as we were doing last night in a beautiful restaurant here, about global warming and about climate change and politics and all that too. We're very good at doing that. But this was a way of our having another kind of physical, in some ways a romantic conversation. And so it was one of the great joys of my life, and made the pandemic worthwhile, that we were dancing together through that time. And that's how the book ends with that. And actually, with the juxtaposition of the two things that I did for the good of my own soul in the pandemic, were learning to box and learning to dance. And the way that these two things resemble each other, because they're both about mastering a very counterintuitive, stubbornly resistant set of steps that actually resemble each other, because the way you learn to box, the sequence of blows you learn to throw, are just as rigorously formalized as the steps you take in the foxtrot. And thinking about boxing was connected me to my grandfather and my father, and to the whole kind of Jewish immigrant past. And thinking about dancing was connecting me to my daughter and the future and her future. And so that was why I put those two things together.
And it's really beautiful, and it's so nice to. I feel like I know you, Olivia. I feel like I know I know your mother, the baker. I know your whole family. I just feel like I'm part of it. So we're going to go to questions in just a few minutes, but I just want to change the subject briefly and talk about sort of media and the New Yorker and what's happening. And so 30 years, right?
40
years. Oh my God. I'm sorry, I dropped a decade. A decade there. I was telling Adam that and honest to God, I thought they would have to take the Sunday print New York Times out of my cold dead hands, but I've actually given it up and I mean, I haven't given up the New York Times, but I've given up the paper. The one piece of print I will not give up and I will subscribe to forever is the New Yorker. So, and I think it has something to do with with the fact that it's long form and just the experience of connecting to the stories. So, what's happening at the New Yorker? What's coming up next for you?
Well, we're blessed. I'm kind of a North Korean moment. We are blessed to have an editor of genius and a man, limitless vision, our leader, David Remnick. But in fact, we are, because David had a fantastic, David had in addition to all of his skills as a writer and his menschiness as a human being, David had a fantastic insight when he began as the editor of the New Yorker some 20 years ago. And that was that, you'll understand this immediately, advertising was never coming back.
Yeah.
Magazines had lived on advertising forever, and everyone was trying to lure the advertisers back. And David said, it's never coming back. We have to depend on our subscribers and on the subscription price. And he made a major gamble, a business gamble, on the idea that our subscribers, like you, would stay with us even as the price went up a bit too. And that's how the magazine survives and makes a profit. And we're a good little business now on exactly that basis, because our readers, thankfully, have stayed with us. That means that we have to give our readers something that's significant. And the mix of the news that we give and our engagement with when I started at the New Yorker 40 years ago, we were not on the news. We were kind of aggressively, almost ostentatiously, often off the news, right? We were not doing that. We no longer are. We have a very vibrant online section, and as I was saying, David called me when we were in the middle of the reception, and I felt I had to take the call because it was conceivably something that had to be written tonight that we would post tomorrow morning. And that's a wonderful new part of it. But the core of what we do are long-form pieces. The one thing about the New Yorker the three things about the New Yorker that I think people sometimes miss is that we are not a magazine of social commentary. We are a magazine of criticism, of reporting, and of humor. And those are the three elements that braid together in our DNA and have since Harold Ross of Aspen, Colorado, founded us almost 100 years ago. And so, I've been a citizen of the New Yorker essentially all my adult life. I started before I was 30, and I hope to go on. And the other nice thing about it, too, is that if you write for the New Yorker long enough, I think you become a friend in people's homes. My dear, wonderful, writer I love and adore, Calvin Trillin. I grew up with Bud Trillin. I grew up with his daughters, with Abigail and Sarah, with his wonderful wife, Alice. And people have said that my wife, Martha, has sort of taken Alice's place, right, in some ways in my own writing. And that's a very special set of attachments and allegiances that you create with readers, and I cherish and try to honor that attachment.
Yeah, but you do feel, as a reader of the New Yorker, you do feel sort of a sense of belonging to the publication in the same way as I'm looking at Breeze now. People feel about NPR. You feel like you are part of that community and the family, and it's part of your identity.
Absolutely, and any organization in the media or any magazine or newspaper that creates that has a responsibility to sustain it. Yeah. And I'm a bit of a pain in the ass, actually, because I make a big fuss about that with David and with Henry, that the New Yorker has a tradition. New Yorker has a history that we have to honor, and we shouldn't ever step too far outside our tradition, but we have to, while still creating, while still being engaged with our time.
So no AI written, ChatGPT
I did a piece about AI for the magazine about playing with DALL-E, the visual thing, and that was enormous fun, and I learned a lot. But no, we're not about to do. Although I once did I do a side gig I do a broadcast for the BBC in London on Sunday mornings, and I asked ChatGPT write an essay in the manner of Adam Gopnik for the BBC on Sunday morning, and it did a very good job.
Okay, well there you go.
Exactly.
You know why it did a good job? Because it's learned it has ingested all of the pieces that you've ever written. It's spitting it back to you.
It caught my mannerisms, but it didn't have any point to make, so I still believe that I'll be all right. I'll survive it.
That's hilarious. All right, well at that, I think we're going to move to questions. We have mics. So I would ask you to raise your hand, and if you feel comfortable doing so, please say your name and then ask your question. And I cannot. Here we go, right here. So somebody's always got to go first. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joel Robinson. Thank you for your talk tonight. I apologize for not having read your book, but you may have answered this question. How do we create a climate and atmosphere for young people to accomplish things? We live in a world of bell curves, whether it's IQs, whether it's manual dexterity, whether it's curiosity, and everybody's got a peak somewhere. And I worry that these people in plumbing, you brought up plumbing yourself, tradesmen, woodworkers, you name it, there's a whole bunch of people out there in that middle range who need to be encouraged and empowered. What can we do?
I couldn't agree more, and one of the things in the course of being out on the road with this book, so many people have come to me after who are engaged in apprenticeship programs or in what's called mastery teaching, forms of education that don't depend on conventional curriculum, but depend on hands-on teaching. I have 5 siblings, all of whom have PhDs. I am the only one who is not a college professor in the family. We call that a Jewish dropout. And one of my sisters is a great, outstanding developmental psychologist, and she said once, if we taught our kids softball the way we teach them science, they would hate softball as much as they hate science. Meaning that you have to learn, the way we really learn is through holistically, right? Through engagement. And the more we can encourage educators to think in those terms, and that's kind of one of the sub-themes of this book, to make accomplishment more significant than achievement. Kids learn more with cards in their hand, doing tricks, and they can take some time to do that. And my son is now doing a PhD in philosophy. He's going to be another college professor. But that's a good path for people to take.
Yeah, wonderful. There's a question right here.
Going
I'll
back
move to this side.
Going back to AI, how do you foresee expertise changing? I mean, learning new skills, it seems like our next generation may become more lazy when it comes to researching or becoming an expert in a specific field. So how do you see, if you wrote this book 15, 20 years from now, how would that change?
You know, the one thing I'd say, and whenever I say these things, it enrages Olivia, who because she thinks it's kind of a bit fusty, but I have lived long enough to live through a few technological revolutions or seeming technological revolutions, right? And in every single one, what people say is they will empty our kids' heads, and they will no longer be, engaged in reading and writing and so on. People used to say that about television, right? That was, that television would be the death of everything. Now we treat television like the family hearth, and it happens all the time in our family and others too. Please get off your goddamn computer and come and watch television with the rest of the family. And every time something like that will happen. And at every moment, things alter, but the core passion that people feel for to learn and to my mind, remains remarkably intact. It's certainly true, for instance, that one kind of expertise has been destroyed. If you're a teacher now, there's no point in teaching the difference between a eulogy and an elegy, because the kids can get that on their phones in a second, right? But that doesn't mean there's nothing worth teaching. It just means that that particular kind of thing isn't worth teaching, in exactly the same way that 100 years ago it no longer was, or 50 years ago, no longer really important to teach handwriting, because everybody could use that didn't mean the teaching stopped. It just meant teaching handwriting was no longer as important. So I'm an optimist in that way about the future. At every one moment, technology is simplifying or conquering something, but that doesn't mean that the real work of teaching, because what's the real work of education? I was just writing about this morning. It's simple, right? It's taking all of our abstract ideas and testing them against our actual experience. And that's whether it's, astrology, are there really such things as Scorpio personalities? Or it's politics, or do different ethnic groups really have different innate capacities? We're constantly testing our abstractions against real experience. That's what education is, and nothing, I think, can alter that.
Wonderful. On this side, yeah, here we go, right in the back. Thank you.
Hi, I love what you said about the teachers, and you've had so many great teachers. I want to know, who have you mentored, and what's become of them in your writing? Do you teach anybody yourself?
I try to. I've had a wonderful. I'm not a very good. I will confess, I'm not a good teacher in the conventional sense. Like, I've taught. I'm using the like. Like is like kudzu weed. It enters your mind. I'm not a very good creative writing teacher because I'm a little too impatient. And I'm good at learning things myself, but not necessarily good at teaching them. I have had a wonderful series of assistants, though, apprentices, and I always have someone around. And I've tried to mentor and, to use that cheap but appropriate word, empower them. And the thing I find that I always try to teach them are two things. One is that writing, which is what they're curious about, what they want to learn, is a physical task before it's a mental task, that it's simply, it responds to, it's susceptible to hour after hour of bending over a keyboard. And the other thing is that, you mentioned at the beginning, and my dear friend Malcolm Gladwell's famous 10,000 hours, right? And I'll try and tell the story quickly. But Luke, my son, was curious about that once. He said to me, "Dad, when did you start writing?" And I explained to him, and he said, "Dad, then your 10,000 hours were up in May of 1986. I started in 80. And I said, "That's hilarious, because it's when my first piece was published in the New Yorker."
Well, there you go. Wow.
And I called Malcolm and said, "You son of a bitch, how does this work?"
Yeah.
And he made the point, he said, "The whole joke is nobody counts hours, we count years. 10,000 hours is 6 years of work. And any professional program you undertake, whether it's law school or medical school, is basically, or a PhD, is basically a 6-year program." The thing about writing is, and this is the paradox, right? When you're 22 and someone tells you you're going to have to work tirelessly for 6 years and then something good will happen, it seems like forever. Now you say it to us now, right? You say, "Oh, 6 years, I could do 6 years, right, on, with my eyes shut." So those are the two things I try to teach, just the sheer physicality of writing and the necessity of devoting yourself to it for 6 years. And if you do, I guarantee you that there will be a place for you sometime where in the literary world. Where exactly, I don't know, but perseverance is the key to existence.
I love that, the physicality of writing. That's wonderful. Where else? We have another one, right, all the way, and also in the back. We will not discriminate against the back row here.
Hi, so my name's Anna. I wanted to say thank you for your talk. I have a question. You spoke about your phobia and how you had to learn to sort of master, but it was in the inverse. And I just wanted to ask a personal question. What do you think was more challenging, mastering the hobbies that you took up, or mastering sort of unlearning your phobia?
They were similarly difficult. Our phobias, right? The way you, as I'm sure, I would bet the majority of people in this room have been in some therapy like this, cognitive therapy, or not. The way you do it, is you go up the exposure gradient, the exposure ladder, right? You take if you're struggling with fear of flying, you take a short flight, right? And you say, how difficult will it be for you to do this? If you're afraid of heights, you say, could you go to the second floor? We won't, and then you go to the second floor and you look out the window. And then you go to the fourth floor till you're on the 100th floor, right, after a year of work. Same thing is true about struggling with pareiresis. You go into, to be blunt, you go into a public bathroom with a closed stall. You can manage that. Then you can open the stall. Then you go up that. So the difficulty about that is that those of us, everybody who struggles with a phobia, has created a whole set of behaviors to avoid having to ever confront it. The way somebody is afraid of heights is not that they look scared when they're high up, it's they never go anywhere near high up, right? And those of us who suffer from pareiresis have found all these coping mechanisms over our life to avoid ever being in that situation. It's crippling practically, but it's what we've done. So in that sense, you have a lot of anxiety tied up with it. Learning to draw or learning to dance isn't anxiety provoking in that way, but it's equally difficult if you're trying to do it well. It's because you're conscious of the fact that you're not doing it well, that it's not coming together. So they're equally difficult in that way, but our phobic side, I think, adduces an element of anxiety into our lives, which is why we want to get out of it.
Fascinating, thank you. Let's see, right here in the front, thank you.
Hi, my name's Laurie Michaels. My father was publisher of the New Yorker for a number of years.
Yes.
I wondered about the price. I too occasionally buy it in the airport.
Right.
And it's very expensive now. And is there a concern at all at the New Yorker that while you're producing this more and more wonderful content, or equally wonderful in the past, that your audience is shrinking in terms of who's going to be attracted to it because people don't feel that they need to pay as much anymore?
Right. Well, As a matter of fact, our audience now is larger than it's ever been. Our subscriber base is significantly larger than it's ever been. The newsstand price is a little misleading because we don't really sell that many on the newsstand. You know, that it's, and if you notice, comparable magazines like The Economist sell for similarly shocking news for those of us who grew up in another time. But we're basically a subscription magazine, and we, as I said, our basic compact is with our subscribers, and who continue to renew at, you know, remarkable rates, 75%, 80% renew.
That is remarkable.
And we, you know, we're blessed to have our readers, and we hope that we keep our faith with them, you know, week in, week out. And it's not something that's, how can I put it? It's something we obsess about. It's not something that anybody takes for granted who's a, you know, a veteran enlisted man like me. I'm kind of like, you know, an NCO at the magazine. I have no editorial responsibilities as such, but I've been around so long that, you know, I remember how we took the last hill back in, you know, '08, and we discuss it. You know, simple things like, I'll give you an example of that. When 9/11 happened, David Remnick had to decide whether there should be any cartoons in our issue. All of us were put to work writing. I wrote a piece about the experience of New York. Other people wrote about all of that. And David called the you know, those of us who'd been around a while and said, do we have cartoons in the issue or not? And he finally, and I said we should, because even in the Hiroshima issue, we'd had cartoons. And David said, this is the one time, because it's about New York and about a catastrophe in New York, then we shouldn't. And he didn't, and he was right.
Thank you. Yes, just right here, and then I'll come. Then
Probably carry.
Yes, indeed.
it's all right. I think we probably want the mic anyway. Yep.
Hi, my name is Greg Lewis.
Hey, Greg.
We seem to lose the art of writing now among children in a world of texting, in a world of video communication. Are you concerned about the future of writing as not only a communications form, but as an art form?
I live and die by sentences. All I really care about in life, my children aside, and the Montreal Canadiens aside, are sentences. Shaping sentences, making sentences. As I get older, I become more obsessive about it and happier to be doing it, and more conscious of the art form of it. And so, of course, it worries me. Here's the, you know, someone for coming back off this gentleman's question, resembles it. I think one of the most remarkable and perhaps too little discussed features of our literary life in the past 20 years is that at the very moment when everyone is telling us that kids have shorter and shorter attention spans, they're reading longer and longer books, right? I remember when the Harry Potter books first came out, and I would read them to Olivia's brother, right? And I thought, oh my God, this thing is never going to end, right? This goes on and on and on, the first one, right? This will never work, right? This thing is never going to take, right? We were in France at the time, and we all know the truth of it, right? And not only Harry Potter, but the Aragon series. Kids read and have an enormous appetite for these limitlessly long books that then implicate them in getting the next limitlessly long book, right? Inhabiting that world. I think that's simply true, right? And I think it's hugely encouraging in that way. The appetite for storytelling and story reading remains remarkably persistent. And the other thing I'd say is, you know, literature, writing, is always going to be, to some degree, a minority enthusiasm. And we have a pretty big minority now, you know, coming back to this lady's questions, we have about 1.5 million subscribers to the New Yorker, which is maybe 3 million people look at the magazine. That's, you know, about 5 times as many people as went to see Shakespeare, as were in London at the time of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and so on. So I think that we accept that everything, as Olivia said to me once, is a niche culture now, right? And that's just true. We live in a series of enfolding niche cultures that can have a very bad effect on our politics, and that's a whole other conversation. But it does mean that we have a significant niche, and when a writer matters, David Foster Wallace, Donna Tartt, whomever it is, they make a loud noise when those books drop in the world. So I'm an optimist about that as well.
That's very optimistic. Right over here.
Hi there, thank you. My name's Francis Stuckins. I've been reading The New Yorker since I was 12 years old, maybe even younger. My mom got it all the time. We were fascinated by the cartoons and the covers.
It's the gateway drug.
Yeah, and then started to read, and it started with movie reviews, stuff like that. But you mentioned earlier about magic and music. You talked about Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix. To me, music is magic, and we grew up in that era of rock and roll, changing society. And I used to read On the Town. And would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, music is my passion. My vocation and the thing I live by is sentence making, prose writing, but music is the thing I love most in the world. And as my children can tell you, I afflict them and the neighbors with my very bad jazz piano playing and my rather better jazz guitar playing. And it's the thing I love most. And as you were saying, I've actually now been engaged in a lot of musical projects, writing librettos and lyrics for composers, and a few of my own. And it's the thing I love most. There's a whole section in this book about what for me is the single most interesting question in all of psychology or mastery, and that is, how does music have meaning? Because if you think about it, it's the most astonishing thing in our experience. There are these vibrations in air that have mathematical relations to other vibrations in air, 1, 3, 5 chords and so on. And yet from these purely abstract relations, we make the emotional map of our lives. That this single thing that we turn to when we're troubled, in love, at the height of our erotic rapture, at the depth of our elegiac sadness, we turn to music. How is it that music these abstract relations can have the most powerful emotional effectiveness? So I try, there's a whole chapter in here where I try to talk about that, explore it, begin to figure out as best I can with the help of people who know more than I do how that works. So music is the thing I'm most passionate about in the world, and I agree with you that it is the highest of art forms.
Well, I feel like we've really only I feel like we've really only touched on so many wonderful moments and elements and sort of truths in this book. So I hope everybody will. We unfortunately are out of time, so we're going to have to wrap. But just thank you for sharing all of these insights from the book. I absolutely loved reading it. And I just have to say something before we wrap to this audience, which is I moderate a lot, all over the world, quite honestly. And I have to say, whenever we go to Q&A, this audience always has the most incisive, thoughtful questions. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. This is not my first time. And thank you to Adam for this extraordinary book and spending time with us. Yeah. And we're going to be...
Can I add a quick note? A lot of people have said to me, is this book involve a rejection of politics? Because my previous book was about politics. For me, a pluralistic society depends on a pluralism of pleasures. And that's the foundational aspect of a pluralist society. So that's the politics of this book. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right, bye.
Fabulous. I'm gonna